Ohio, like the rest of the country, has suffered from a drug epidemic, and it's taken too many of the lives of our children and our youth and our communities.
Before dawn broke over Ohio, the machinery of a federal operation was already in motion. Streets were sealed, warehouses surrounded, doors forced open in coordinated strikes that unfolded across Cincinnati, Dayton, Atlanta, and New York. What looked like a standard drug bust on the surface would soon be described by federal officials as something far more consequential, a case that reshaped how the United States understands the fentanyl crisis. That distinction changed everything. It explained how fentanyl could flood American streets while evading traditional interdiction. It revealed why seizures at borders had failed to slow overdose deaths. And it exposed a system designed not to hide from law enforcement but to exist in plain sight. By the time agents moved before sunrise, Operation Box Cutter had already become one of the most dangerous chemical trafficking cases in US history. What they would uncover next would reveal how chemistry, finance, and global trade merged into a supply chain of death. As federal investigators pulled apart the early evidence, a disturbing pattern emerged. This was not a case of chemicals slipping through regulatory cracks. It was a system engineered to exploit them. Every shipment that raised suspicion looked on paper indistinguishable from legitimate scientific trade. Invoices matched market prices. Shipping routes followed approved channels. Export licenses were valid. Nothing appeared illegal until the chemistry was examined molecule by molecule. The companies at the center of the operation were registered chemical exporters based in Shanghai, Wuhan, and Shenzhen. Publicly, they advertised laboratory reagents, pharmaceutical binders, and industrial compounds to universities and research firms worldwide. Privately, investigators say they supplied fentanyl precursors to buyers who understood exactly how those chemicals would be used once they reached American soil. What made the pipeline so dangerous was its simplicity. No drugs crossed borders, no hidden compartments, no traffickers slipping through ports of entry. Only chemicals moved legally, sold legally, shipped legally, received. Federal officials later confirmed that this design allowed the network to bypass traditional interdiction methods almost entirely. As agents tracked shipments across months and continents, they realized the operation functioned less like a cartel and more like a multinational corporation. Orders were processed digitally. Customer communication used encrypted platforms. Chemical compositions were subtly modified to stay ahead of controlled substance lists while remaining effective for fentanyl synthesis. According to prosecutors, this adaptability kept the pipeline alive even as international regulations tightened. Each time a precursor was scheduled for control, a chemically adjacent compound appeared in its place. On paper, it was innovation. In practice, it was lethal intent. Investigators also uncovered a sophisticated financial architecture supporting the chemical trade. Payments were rarely direct. Instead, funds moved through cryptocurrency transactions routed via unregistered Chinese exchanges. Digital assets were converted into yuan, then deposited into accounts tied to state-linked financial institutions. This structure insulated suppliers from US enforcement while obscuring the scale of profits. One seized server recovered in Georgia became a turning point. Inside were more than 6,000 encrypted transaction logs linking American buyers to Chinese exporters and cartel couriers operating in Mexico. Agents described it as a digital cartel economy, an ecosystem designed to resemble normal corporate commerce while facilitating mass poisoning. Shell companies in Hong Kong and Malaysia acted as intermediaries, rerouting shipments through legitimate freight channels. Every shipping document, every customs declaration, every digital signature was crafted with extreme precision. Some records investigators later said showed signs of automated generation designed to mimic academic research orders and institutional procurement. By the time Operation Box Cutter entered its final phase, the scope was staggering. Federal officials estimated the network had evolved into a billion-dollar operation by 2025, supplying chemical inputs that fueled street-level drug production across the Midwest, the East Coast, and the American South. This was not a cartel raid in the traditional sense. No border tunnels, no bales of narcotics crossing deserts or seas. Instead, agents uncovered something colder, quieter, and vastly more dangerous, an industrial-scale chemical supply chain designed to feed America's deadliest epidemic without ever moving finished drugs across a border. What agents now understood was chilling. This was not chaos, it was strategy. Not smuggling, but logistics. Not crime in the shadows, but industrialized deception operating within global trade itself. And the chemicals were already inside the country. By the time investigators shifted focus inward, the chemicals had already reached American hands. The domestic phase of Operation Boxcutter revealed two central figures in Ohio operating quietly while coordinating shipment, storage, and distribution. Their role was not chemistry, but conversion, logistics, and speed across regional networks efficiently nationwide. Eric Payne, 39, managed inbound deliveries disguised as industrial solvents, scheduling arrivals to avoid attention. Orion Rafford, 24, served as the bridge storing chemicals, communicating with overseas suppliers through encrypted apps and connecting buyers linked to cartel intermediaries. Together they enabled transformation from shipment to poison production chains. When warrants were executed before Sunrise agents struck multiple locations simultaneously, homes, storage units, and warehouses were secured within minutes. Inside, they discovered industrial mixers, pill presses, counterfeit molds, firearms, and crypto hardware wallets. The physical evidence confirmed investigators' fears: a fully operational domestic manufacturing hub hidden dangerous lethal active. At the center of the seizure was one figure that eclipsed all others. 139 kilograms of fentanyl powder were recovered. Federal officials stated the quantity could produce 70 million lethal doses, ranking the haul among the deadliest seizures in American law enforcement history ever recorded, nationally documented. For prosecutors, the case crossed a critical threshold. This was no longer trafficking alone, it was industrialized poisoning. The operation converted chemistry into mass casualty potential, leveraging legal trade routes to manufacture death domestically. The language used internally reflected gravity, urgency, and unprecedented scale across multiple states nationwide, repeatedly confirmed. Context from national reporting underscored the stakes. Overdose deaths tied to synthetic opioids continued to devastate communities, with fentanyl responsible for the majority of fatalities. Officials emphasized that precursor control, not street arrests, would determine outcomes in the next phase of America's drug war efforts nationwide, moving forward urgently now. Agents described the raid scenes as methodical and sobering. Rooms designed for mixing and pressing ran around the clock. Digital records mapped supply payment and delivery. Nothing suggested improvisation. Everything indicated planning redundancy and profit optimization, built for longevity, not haste or visibility within criminal enterprise structures domestically embedded deeply. Financial evidence strengthened the case. Cryptocurrency wallets linked domestic buyers to overseas suppliers. Transaction trails mirrored corporate accounting rather than criminal chaos. Investigators noted how this structure delayed detection, diluted risk, and insulated leadership while accelerating production on American soil across regions, states, cities nationwide, quietly, efficiently, continuously, systematically unchecked. As arrests were processed, officials prepared public messaging carefully. They avoided spectacle, focusing on facts. The numbers spoke loudly enough: 139 kilograms, 70 million potential deaths. A domestic factory supplied by a global chemical pipeline operating silently, legally, outwardly hidden within commerce systems nationwide today revealed fully. Inside the targeted buildings, investigators found chemical compounds capable of producing more lethal doses than the entire population of Ohio. The sheer scale stunned even veteran agents. But the real shock was not the quantity, it was the structure. Operation Boxcutter had now exposed the American end of the chain. What remained were the architects abroad and the money sustaining them. Federal agencies understood the implication clearly. Cutting chemicals, crypto, and cash would determine whether this model survived or collapsed. Next phase's operations nationally, internationally ahead, soon decisively. With the domestic factories exposed, federal agencies pivoted toward the financial spine sustaining the operation. Investigators understood that chemicals moved the product, but money moved the system. Without dismantling the flow of payments, any arrests would merely create vacancies. Operation Boxcutter therefore expanded into a synchronized financial and cyber offensive unprecedented in scope for a fentanyl case. Treasury analysts traced cryptocurrency payments flowing from American buyers into unregistered Chinese exchanges. From there, funds were converted into yuan and routed through layered accounts tied to state-linked banks. This structure masked profits while providing speed, liquidity, and distance from United States jurisdiction. It also revealed intent. The architecture was designed in advance, not improvised after the fact. A decisive breakthrough came from digital infrastructure seized during the raids. Servers recovered in Georgia contained encrypted ledgers documenting more than 6,000 transactions. Each entry linked chemical shipments, wallet addresses, intermediary couriers, and delivery confirmations. For agents, the data transformed suspicion into proof. It mapped a living supply chain operating continuously across borders and currencies. Federal cyber teams worked alongside financial crimes units to decrypt records and correlate them with shipping manifests. Patterns emerged quickly, payments followed standardized schedules, volumes scaled predictably, loss contingencies were built into pricing models. Investigators described it as corporate logistics, adapted for criminal ends, optimized for resilience rather than speed alone. As evidence solidified, international coordination accelerated. Interpol issued red notices for executives believed to be sheltering in Hong Kong and Shenzhen. Diplomatic channels were activated quietly. Simultaneously, the Treasury Department froze $3.4 million in assets connected to the indicted companies, disrupting cash flow and signaling a strategic shift. For the first time in more than a decade, an FBI director traveled to China to confront the issue directly. Officials emphasized that the message was not symbolic, it was operational. The United States would no longer focus solely on street-level dealers, while industrial suppliers remained untouched. Chemicals, crypto, and capital were now targets. Public health context reinforced urgency. National reporting showed overdose deaths remained dominated by synthetic opioids, with fentanyl driving fatalities across demographics and regions. Federal officials argued that dismantling precursor supply chains offered the only scalable intervention capable of altering trends. Enforcement had to begin before pills existed. Internally, agencies acknowledged the risk. Targeting overseas chemical suppliers carried diplomatic consequences, but officials concluded that inaction was no longer acceptable. Operation Box Cutter had revealed a blueprint that others could replicate. Leaving it intact meant accepting perpetual escalation. By freezing assets, exposing digital infrastructure, and isolating leadership abroad, investigators aimed to collapse the model itself. Not a single network, but a method. The objective was simple and ruthless. Cut the money, break the pipeline, and the illusion that mass poisoning could hide inside global trade. Officials warned the next phase would arrive quickly, quietly, and without announcement, targeting any supplier attempting to rebuild the same architecture elsewhere under increased scrutiny worldwide from authorities. Operation Box Cutter did more than dismantle a single network. It exposed a structural truth federal officials say can no longer be ignored. Fentanyl is not merely manufactured in hidden rooms. It is assembled through global trade, corporate paperwork, digital finance, and regulatory blind spots that reward scale and invisibility. In briefings following the arrest, officials emphasized a strategic pivot. The United States would stop measuring success solely by seizures and sentences. The new metric would be prevention upstream. If chemicals never reached domestic converters, pills would never reach streets. If money stopped moving, production would stall. This logic reframed the drug war from reaction to disruption. Federal officials revealed that this network operated as a corporate system engineered to blend into legitimate global commerce. On paper, everything appeared legal. The shipments were labeled as laboratory reagents, pharmaceutical binders, and industrial solvents. The paperwork was pristine, too pristine. The case also forced agencies to coordinate in ways rarely attempted. FBI, DEA, Homeland Security Investigations, Treasury, and the Department of Justice synchronized physical raids with cyber analysis and financial sanctions. That alignment, officials said, shortened timelines that once took years into weeks. It also sent a signal to suppliers watching closely abroad. Public messaging remained restrained, but the implications were unmistakable. Operation Box Cutter marked the first time a fentanyl investigation struck an entire supply chain at once. Not just dealers, not just labs, but exporters, intermediaries, financiers, and infrastructure. Investigators called it a blueprint for future operations already underway. Reporting across national outlets underscored why the shift mattered. Synthetic opioids continued to dominate overdose statistics, devastating rural towns and major cities alike. Traditional interdiction had failed to reverse trends. By targeting precursors and profits, officials believed they finally addressed the system fueling the crisis rather than its symptoms. Yet authorities acknowledge the challenge ahead. Chemical markets adapt quickly, suppliers innovate, financial channels mutate. Success would require constant pressure, faster controls, and international cooperation that often moves slower than criminal networks. Operation Box Cutter was a beginning, not an endpoint. Behind closed doors, officials spoke candidly about stakes, allowing industrial-scale poisoning to masquerade as commerce threatened public health and national security simultaneously. The response, they argued, had to be equally systemic. Enforcement would now follow chemistry code and capital wherever they traveled. As the final indictments were unsealed and assets frozen, one principle guided the strategy forward. Do not chase the pill. Cut the line that makes it possible. End the transaction before the mixture. Interrupt the ledger before the shipment. Stop the poison before it exists. Operation Box Cutter closed one chapter, but it opened another. Federal agencies confirmed additional investigations were active, targeting suppliers who believed distance and paperwork offered protection. The message was unambiguous. The era of invisible fentanyl pipelines was ending. The next wave would arrive without warning. Officials cautioned that victories would be measured quietly. There would be fewer headlines, fewer photos, and fewer public raids. Success would appear as absence, fewer overdoses, fewer counterfeit pills, fewer families broken. In that silence, they argued the strategy would finally prove its worth. Over time, prevention would speak louder than arrests ever could nationwide for communities across the country. This operation, later named Operation Box Cutter, had been under investigation for more than 2 years. It began quietly in 2022 when U.S. Customs officers in Chicago flagged unusual shipments arriving from China. The documentation was flawless. The suppliers appeared legitimate, but chemical testing told a different story. What agents identified were fentanyl precursors, the molecular building blocks used to manufacture one of the most lethal synthetic opioids in human history. At that moment, investigators realized they were not chasing street dealers or rogue labs. They were confronting an invisible industrial pipeline. As the investigation expanded, the scope became clear. The network stretched across 3 countries. 29 individuals were charged. Among them were 22 Chinese nationals, 4 Chinese chemical corporations, and 3 American facilitators operating domestically. Prosecutors described it not as a smuggling ring, but as a Chinese-run corporate enterprise, disguised as scientific trade. Unlike traditional drug trafficking, no completed narcotics crossed international borders. Only chemicals did. They were sold legally, shipped legally, and delivered legally until they were transformed inside the United States into counterfeit oxycodone and Xanax pills. One federal agent summarized the operation with chilling clarity. They were not selling drugs. They were selling the ability to make them.